The online Mario Kart 8 community is delusional and gets in the way of its own progression. I really don't know what to make of it anymore because while the scene is larger and more active than it's ever been before, with many new innovations and successes, as someone who has spent a long time thinking about the community's direction, I find myself disappointed with the direction that's been chosen. There's no quick way to describe why that is the case, but that's why today's topic is so important to me, because I want to provide some context and at the end discuss how I think things should be. I say all of this because the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Lounge might be simultaneously the greatest yet most catastrophic innovation that the community has ever conjured up. The lounge is community built and acts as the solo queue that the game never had built in. On one hand, the lounge creates a matchmaking queue that allows people to jump into competitive matches with roughly equally skilled opponents at every hour of the day. This is something that wouldn't otherwise exist outside of worldwide races, but those leave a lot to be desired for the more competitive audience. On the other hand though, the lounge can be a ruthless, addictive lottery system that not only dumbs down the gaming community groupthink attached to it, but it can have a straight up negative impact on people if they get too attached to the grind as well. Today I want to explain why the lounge has practically zero competitive merit and should strictly be seen as a way to play pickup games and practice. And despite everything I'm about to say about it, the lounge can be a great thing. I love seeing legitimately positive content stemming from it, spreading across YouTube and introducing new players to our community, and I think it's also an excellent way to improve some of your skills. It is just something that needs to be enjoyed responsibly. But anyway, let's begin the rant. Before any deep dive into the problems of the lounge system, we first have to understand MMR, the rating system used for matchmaking within the server. MMR is a variation of your traditional ELO rating, and in this case, it applies to 12 players in a match in order to fit our game. After a match is played, your rating is adjusted based on the results. Beating higher opponents will award a higher gain, and losing to lower ranked opponents will result in a bigger loss, yada yada. It is a self-correcting system that attempts to monitor the improvement of players. The most trivial example of a set of lounge matches would display this. What would happen in a 6 vs 6 squad queue match if each team had the same total MMR at the start? Well, the winning team's players would all gain 100, and the losing team's players would all lose 100, which is pretty simple to comprehend. But let's say all 12 of these players did not play another match until the next 6v6 queue, and the teams got paired together again, same lineups, all of that. Let's say that this time the team that lost the first match ends up winning. As a reward, the players would roughly win about 108 MMR. Now, despite both teams having a 1-1 record with the exact same starting conditions, the players who won the second match would gain 16 MMR on their opponents overall. This is due to a natural recency bias built into ELO systems. By losing the first game, they beat a higher ranked team as a lower ranked team, while the team that won the first game lost to a lower ranked opponent. This is perhaps what makes the lounge an addicting system. When you're winning, everything is right in the world, but when you're losing, it makes it easier to gain again and right any wrongdoings. When you realize this, any attempt to see MMR as an objective measure of player skill kind of falls out the window, because nothing is ever permanent. After any undesirable result, a player can always choose to queue again in an attempt to rewrite the effect of recency bias. It might work, it might not work, but if it doesn't, it's okay, because if you just queue up again, it's even easier. The gains get easier as the rooms get easier. The only negative is the temporary embarrassment that heavily invested players might feel in this period where their rank is below what they want it to be. But as long as they keep queuing, it will eventually balance itself out, right? Well, sometimes it doesn't, because a lot of us overrate ourselves, and this is by no mean a shot or some kind of call out. I'm guilty of it at times too. There are a lot of factors to blame if things go wrong. Bad RNG, inting teammates, room quality allegedly is one too. The truth of the matter is, while all these things can impact a player, these are almost always just excuses for people with warped perspectives. I know this is something no serious lounge player is going to want to hear, but the rank you think you deserve is probably the one that you don't. Some of you listeners have probably internally thought to yourselves, well, I actually did reach my goal. I hit the rank I expected of myself, so whatever he's talking about doesn't apply to me. My expectations were reasonable. And you would be wrong, because I'm actually talking exactly about players with this mindset. This is because it's not just that players can effectively erase the negative consequences of any given match with time, it's that once a player hits their peak, or begins approaching their perceived limit, they can simply make the decision to stop playing without penalty. If you want to find out if your actual skill level matches your MMR, you can find out by playing about 50 more matches. If it remains steady, then you can rationally claim that you probably deserve it. If your rating goes down or even up, it is likely not an accurate measure. The thing is, everybody has a hypothetical limit or peak. Players can of course improve or get better and expand that ceiling, But reaching that limit does not provide any evidence that you've improved. What it likely means is that you're on an abnormal winning streak. Now, abnormal winning streaks require a lot of things to go right. First off, it almost certainly does require that you're playing pretty well. Even in a metagame full of RNG, how you play definitely still matters, but that is a bit of a baseline expectation for obtaining a peak. There are other times where you will play well, where you won't see a big winning streak, and that's because some luck is usually involved in the process as well. Let's be real for a second. Even if you're playing above your normal standards, it is incredibly hard to have a 16 win to 4 loss stretch against a group of players around your skill level. Some players won't ever hit their theoretical MMR limit, and others will get pretty close. Some might get lucky and hit their limit quickly, while others might be willing to play 1,000 matches to ensure that they eventually get the luck required to hit the winning streak that propels them to the rank that they think is indicative of their ability. Here's my bold take. Nobody deserves their peak MMR. The more matches you've played, the more likely that is the case. Win streaks are called win streaks for a reason. Usually there's no streak happening at all. But when you eventually stack wins together, you will have a moment in time where recency bias shines in your favor before you either quit or things go back to normal. I don't say this as a way to diminish anyone's achievements either. It still is an achievement to be able to say that you've hit a certain rank even if it likely isn't sustainable. It is just important to point out that your peak MMR necessarily requires a streak of good luck to obtain, whether that be in-game or through some strong partner performances. And there's nothing wrong with that. Everyone is bound to have a lucky stretch. But while hitting a rank is a good achievement, the rankings when you hit it won't be accurate. This is because it's not possible for everybody to peak at the same time. A ranking snapshot at any given time will feature a bunch of people at high points and low points and anywhere between. What this all means though, is that MMR hides a lot of vital information. I think it's a good system for getting a rough idea of a player's ability, but the community overrates how valuable of a metric it actually is. The truth is, some people can be accurately ranked by MMR, while others are grossly underrated or overrated by theirs, and this is a constantly changing cycle. An underranked player might go on a big winning streak and become overranked overnight, and this makes the idea of taking ranks at face value pretty silly. I would argue that most overranked players see themselves as properly rated, while most properly rated players alongside genuinely underranked players see themselves as underrated. It is why you hear people talk about their bad luck so much more than their good luck at the end of the day. Nobody is an inherently unlucky player. If you think you are, your perspective is just warped. If you can successfully gaslight yourself into thinking that you're better than your honest-to-God ordinary ranking, of course everything's gonna feel unlucky. But now that I've explained the lounge and its MMR system, I guess I could talk about ways to combat this, quote, problem. I could talk about the implementation of a MMR decay system to force overranked players to actually play the game to continually prove their status. I'm already now thinking of the potential issues to that system too, like how that would just make those that happen to peak near the end of the season extra lucky, but I've had to stop myself from even going down this pipeline, because I reject what the problem actually is. In my mind, the problem runs much deeper than the MMR system is imperfect. The real problem lies on the shoulders of the Mario Kart community itself and its players. The problem is that we know that this system is unserious, yet we continue putting infinite stock into it anyway. Now, I bet some of you laughed a little. Some of you were probably like, so true, man. And some of you think that you don't actually care that much about Lounge or the MMR system, but actually do. More than you like to admit at least, or perhaps even realize. But to many of the people who think that they only play for fun or to stay fresh, some of you have a few tells. Some of you show emotion about it, whether that's through anger, sadness, or even glee. I've seen people complaining about their item luck, calling the game trash. I've seen people complain about their partner luck, saying it's impossible to win with a low partner average. The anger this invokes in people is obviously irrational. Everybody's playing the same game and has the same opportunity to get fortunate luck as anyone else, whether that be through items or partners. Yet still, there are still some misconceptions about how luck even works. If your item luck always seems to be worse no matter what, it is not a probability issue, it is an issue with your approach to the game. If your partner average is demonstrably lower after a large sample, the conclusion shouldn't be that a random partner selector feeds you worse allies. This is not how probability works at all. It should be that you aren't doing enough as a teammate to help them. If you're separated from your partner every single race, it makes it harder for them to dodge or win up front. I recommend seriously evaluating if you're actually a good teammate, because it goes much deeper than just not team killing. But whether or not the anger is rational or irrational also doesn't matter, because what it proves is that the community cares way too much about a number. And this doesn't necessarily happen just because people care about their own rating. It might happen because they care about how others see their rating. Let's be realistic here. We have Discord bots in this community that allow people to stat check anyone at any time. This functionality was somehow a priority to us over many more useful things that could actually lead to real player improvement. I've seen instances of people checking the last 5, last 10, and last season stats of rivals just to try to cherry pick some data that makes them look bad or carried. I've seen people treat others differently or even as lesser based on rankings and peaks, and some have been provided or denied team or partner opportunities on the premise and perceptions of the system. Many people in this community are nice, but many otherwise ordinary people have let themselves be heavily influenced by this all. I've had opponents insult me over my rank before because I did something that annoyed them in a match. Often, many complaints happen because opponents literally did not have the full picture of my situation. This can still happen to you even when you play rationally, but complaining in a chat for some people acts as a way to deflect blame. It's a way to let others know that you only didn't win because X thing happened and Y person is dumb for doing so. It's a way that people try to protect their all-important status, and often they pass off any blame on lower ranked players. It creates an environment where people start to buy the absolutely ludicrous idea that a higher ranked player will always outplay or make the correct decision over a lower ranked player, when that has never been the case in any competition or sport ever. But while misplays happen and could be seen as individually unlucky, they too should be roughly distributed evenly in the same way as normal item luck. At the end of the day, almost all the toxicity that occurs as a result of them is baseless in the long run and ego-driven to begin with. I understand why it's frustrating when you lose because someone else did something not optimal for themselves, but quite frankly, this system doesn't deserve people caring this much about it. If you catch yourself angrily writing in the chat after races, please take this as a reality check in the future and figure yourself out. There are other reasons beyond just timing of a streak as to why MMR is silly. Another big one is that win streaks often depend on your partner contributing, and in some instances, partners can even carry you to a win streak even while you're playing average at best. And of course, they can be responsible for losing streaks too. But this extra layer of damage is all self-inflicted. One of the most ironic things about this all is that all the players who complain about their partner average have an option to select free-for-all ahead of every event. With that said, players still choose to play the 2v2 format more than any other format by a long shot. Here's my take on the matter. If you're playing to gain MMR and you don't vote FFA, you're essentially admitting that you don't trust your own abilities. Because while the format is a bit more variable in its outcomes, it still takes away partners and their scores, and any amount of additional luck that is added into the FFA format from 2v2 is completely offset and then some by not having to rely on a partner's score. Your partner's score is the luck that usually matters the most, because the difference between them scoring 40 and 120 is usually the difference between getting first and getting last. You don't have an excessive amount of control on what happens there. Yes, it is true that partner luck will also even out over time, but for a ladder that's designed to be fast-paced and climbable, this slows down the process of gains and losses significantly and unnecessarily so. So for players who do vote 2v2, you are literally asking for this extra random variable to impact your matches that directly takes away from the impact of your own score. Yes, 2v2 is a more skill-oriented format for the team at large, but as an individual in a solo queue, the outcomes are not more skill-oriented for the individual player. I think I know why 2v2 is selected more though by certain players. In free-for-all, your outcome is good or bad solely depending on your own score, and in 2v2 sometimes you can still gain despite scoring poorly, and that is still seen as a positive result. But when you get a bad result despite scoring well, at the very least you have an excuse. In the end, there are more desirable outcomes for an ego-driven player. Perhaps the greatest irony when it comes to the hate on the FFA format is that the logical conclusion shouldn't point towards a community that prefers 2v2 instead. It should point to a community that prefers 6 versus 6. If you want the individual score to have the most amount of impact, you should like FFA the most. And if you want the best unit or team to win more often than not, then you should like 6v6. 2v2 is a weird middle ground, because most of the problems present in FFA are still very much present in 2v2, just at a slightly lessened rate. And this also goes for 3v3, where they are still present but slightly less than in 2v2. Take this race, for example, the final race of a 3v3 squad queue. My team is fighting to hold on to 3rd place, and Team K and L are currently fighting each other to win the event. We have some top spots, but a player from K and L both find themselves between us after K horns their way into 2nd. L has 2 reds in 3rd, and uses the first to break K's final item. This makes some sense, but what happens next is frustrating for us. I don't have an item in hand, and I can't punish a 2nd red throw. But what appears to happen next is this player taps the wall or experiences some massive slowdown, and as a result, the 2nd red shell becomes my problem, despite the fact that the immediate threat for Team L is right in front of them in second and defenseless at that. Because we are all ultimately fighting for the highest amount of points from the same total amount, this is a zero-sum game. Any disadvantage in obtaining a higher point total for a race creates a necessary advantage for at least one of the other teams in the match. The issue here is that while one team's mistake might cause a disadvantage for them, the corresponding advantage is not distributed evenly across the other teams in the game. In this case, my team was also put at a disadvantage for actions we were not responsible for, which resulted in a third and fourth party being the ones to gain from this exchange. This instance stands out in recent memory because it did lead to a sequence of events that resulted in us getting last. The player on K who wasn't redded out went on to win the race after we took the blue, but despite a solid race for them, they came up just 1 point short to L anyway. This small moment in the match wasn't a good thing for the L team, but it ultimately didn't cost them. However, it meant everything for us. The reality of the lounge is that you have 11 opponents and there are multiple different teams. Every time you're hit or someone inconveniences you, you are technically targeted, whether it be deliberate or accidental, or optimal or baseless. Of course, everyone should hypothetically have the same odds of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and this fortune of course should all even out with time. But ideally, competitive players should want to minimize this kind of variance where they can. Undeniably, our game has an RNG element and lounge matches have an interactive free-for-all style. We're not like track and field athletes who stay in their own lane, we're more similar to a NASCAR race where one person crashing might take 10 others with them. Luckily for us, we do have a format in 6v6 that removes the targeting problem entirely since it's a head-to-head format. This means that in a zero-sum game like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, one team's disadvantage will always directly correspond with an equal advantage to the other team. This means that in 6v6, any negative situation an opponent puts you into can't really be complained about, because if the opponent would directly gain from your loss, their actions would be warranted. Even in an exchange where a player slow owns you or makes a mistake, if it works, it's likely optimal. Even if your opponent could have done something better, you can't really complain about it because them not doing so is simply better for you. If the outcome isn't better for you, it's on you to adapt to the playstyle. Aggressive play and passive play can both have their uses here. But with all of this considered, it's a bit of a shame that the community's most active source for pickup games ignores a head-to-head format in favor of free-for-all formats. But it's also true that free-for-all games can still be popular and even quite competitive. Fortnite's a very obvious example of a free-for-all game being incredibly popular, but in my opinion what makes it work so well is the fact that there are rewards for aggressive play. Many games out there find unique ways to incentivize a player to take chances, and often this is what makes a game fun to begin with. Fortnite succeeds in this regard because every time you're able to eliminate somebody, you get their loot. So taking someone out is not targeting a player necessarily, it's targeting an advantage state that can be taken through their elimination. And in the endgame, a player with a bunch of kills will typically be more prepared in a face-off against someone who's been passively scraping on by. The Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Lounge is not like this, however. A matter of fact, establishing yourself as a quote peaceful player has become an ideal strategy for many. I've watched VODs of friends who will actually pass up on hitting someone when on paper it's likely the optimal play. The idea here is that you don't want to make enemies, which is a completely ridiculous notion when you think about it, because when the positives outweigh neutrality on a decision, you should be taking the positives. But in a setting where players are frequently emotional and frequently have convinced themselves that they're unlucky players, you can't assume for 1 second that they'll trust that you hitting them was a rational decision. There should be no world where peace play should be dictating what is and isn't optimal. If anything, it is a slippery slope that leads to teaming. Players who don't subscribe to this playstyle might even gain reputations as violent players who are not to be trusted though, and this might also warp how situations are approached in general. There are some situations where it is in the better interest of two players to be peaceful around each other, and that isn't teaming, it's just because a game situation demands it. Commonly, this happens when first place is holding a mushroom and second place could red them out, but they choose not to in case a blue shell arise, for instance. But again, reputation might choose how someone acts. At the very least, this might be more of an issue in higher level lobbies where opponents are usually played against more, but it is still true that in many levels that you might want to think twice about ending someone's race early on in a match because you never know how they're going to respond to it. Player reputation might not even be the extent of all of it though. The lounge also has many different languages spoken in many cultures. A little over half of all the players come from the Japanese side of the community, which historically has been split off from the West. For quite some time now, the lounge has acted as a gathering place for all, but there are still some differences in cultures, and from what I can tell, there's sometimes hostility between the players who mainly speak Japanese and those who mainly speak English online. Of course, I've had many Japanese 2v2 partners who have been extremely kind to me, but I've also on occasion had some who are not so much. I've seen disparaging remarks written in Japanese about foreign players directed at me and my friends before, and I've even seen some top Japanese players tweet about wanting foreign players out of the lounge. Maybe from their perspective, overseas players are just laggy players who don't pick Excite Bike Arena. Maybe we are less enjoyable to play against, and perhaps that creates a negative connotation for all overseas players. I have found at times that in my nighttime matches, it's easier for me to dodge shocks when I'm using the most common Yoshi color of the room. And one explanation could be that Japanese players specifically go out of their way to not dodge me even when it's to their benefit. But this also might be an instance of confirmation bias on my part. I've not done any official studies on this or collected any data. It's also possible that using a common Yoshi color means someone thinks I'm likely their partner even when I'm not. The reasons as to why these thoughts feel like possibilities though has to do with my personal experiences admittedly. When I play poorly, my teammate seems more likely to get angry at me if they don't speak English regularly. This might be because it's harder to understand one another, but it might not. It might be because they're less likely to know about who I am, since I haven't been involved in their scene for decades like I have for the Western community. Despite being a foreigner, they don't realize I'm one of the founders of the server to begin with. If I was being honest, I would say there is a decent amount of subtle teaming going on in the lounge. This is not to say that teaming is the main objective of most players, but changing your actions depending on the players it might impact, even occasionally, is a form of teaming, and as such, cheating. But this stuff is not exactly easy to detect. It's easily deniable, and it's not really solvable in free-for-all and Mogi formats. Really, it seems like it is just something that must be accepted in the lounge and moderated to the best of the staff's ability. With that said, there also have been forms of very deliberate teaming, and even instances of bans being handed out to players from the West. Sometimes traditional 6v6 teams are even part of the problem if players within a team or group want to try to boost each other up by playing peacefully around each other, even when they're assigned to different teams. It might not sound like a huge deal, but even having one target off your back in a 2v2 Mogi is a massive advantage over your competition. There is not a whole lot to say about this I haven't covered already. Obviously, lounge formats are vulnerable to this, and that is a flaw of the system that is difficult to get around. Really, all we can do is better understand it and perhaps realize that the system probably shouldn't be seen as the single most important metric there is for assessing player skill, as plenty of reasons why that shouldn't be the case have been laid out. But here's the thing. Perhaps downright heinous teaming attempts have been made precisely because players take it so seriously. Some players would do just about anything to be seen as a diamond player after all. So let's summarize up to this point. Our main form of competition has a lot of flaws. The rating system does not make for an accurate ranking system. It brings out the worst in all of us, whether that be through toxicity and ego, through delusion, or through subtle forms of cheating like teaming. The culture has led to a world where players value their own rating over their actual skill level, completely unaware that there's even a difference to begin with. We play formats that make front-running and playmaking relatively optional facets of the game, and formats that make us feel justified in complaining about things that are outside of our control. We would rather re-roll after a bad match than ever time trial a new track, and as mentioned in previous videos, the community unnecessarily limits itself in the variety of tracks that are played to begin with. All of this is powered through addiction to a system that feels unfulfilling, and when people finally break the cycle and quit, they think that the game is at fault rather than ever questioning if we've actually just limited its potential. And I don't see how this problem is fixable either, because nobody really acknowledges that a problem actually exists. After all, Lounge is the easiest form of play to use for content creation. It's truly a 24/7 system now, and so many of the largest streamers and now YouTubers in the community use it, and their MMR, as a way to create content to begin with. I personally cannot stand the MMR overlay that many Lounge streamers use. It is not an interesting piece of information that justifies any space on a screen, because it literally only ever updates once an hour. But that's not even why. I dislike it because what it does is bring a sense of credibility to the MMR system, which only contributes to more people viewing it in this undeserving light. And when so many take a simple number as gospel, it generates all the wrong conversations. We have gotten to the point where I've seen Reddit threads where people have brought up MMR ranking as a way to compare certain YouTubers. The gap was relatively large in the comparison I'm thinking about, and MMR was a valid way to distinguish the players, but again, for all the reasons I've shared, I just can't help but feel that we could be doing so much better than this. But none of these people will ever understand the flaws of the MMR system. The system is easy to simply take as fact, especially when many top players place value in it. A few months back, Kusan, the undisputed GOAT of the MK8 Lounge, made a video that exposed some potential flaws in the system. It did not seem as the purpose of the video was to dunk on the system though, but rather to provide context. This video came during Season 11, the first one in ages where he had not hit his usual Grandmaster peak. He was talking about the best players in Japan. I'm not sure if it was in regard to who should be on Team Japan, or if he was just comparing the players who already made it, but he pointed out that his average level of competition was higher this season than the rest. It showed that everyone who hit Grandmaster faced easier opponents than himself. Now, I haven't run the numbers myself, but I doubt it's something he would lie about. But if the purpose here was to discuss who most deserves to be on Team Japan, MMR is probably not the best metric to use given it's a 6v6 tournament. This should be conventional knowledge. 6v6 is clearly different than most Mogi formats, and a player of his caliber clearly understands that. But if the purpose was instead to show why he wasn't Grandmaster, well, it does go to show that this might be a touchy subject for some. And if a player of this level, especially a pretty calm and focused one, validates the importance of the system, it is easy to see why everyone else just tends to follow, regardless of whether or not it is actually healthy for the game. We have gotten to the point where streamers can feel self-conscious about this number. Many top players will drop out of a queue if they assess a risk in losing MMR, and what does this say about MMR? Well, if people would rather not play as a means of protecting it, it says that the value is pretty important to them, and perhaps even more important than playing the game to begin with. This perceived importance is why many show an additional layer of anger when they lose badly. Excuses often follow, but the number on screen is somehow seen as irrefutable. It is true that players don't deserve their peaks, but it's also true that they don't deserve their valleys either. But rather than just pointing this out, or acknowledging that maybe some blame should fall on their own shoulders during a losing streak, I see content creators often blame the game instead. Impressionable viewers might trust these streamers to tell them the truth, when perhaps these streamers are just trying to protect their image as a top player when going on a genuinely unlucky losing streak. But blaming the game when your MMR is in its lower range is not placing the blame in the rightful place. It is the system's fault for overreacting to every recent win and loss, and pretending like anything else is responsible is nothing more than group-encouraged gaslighting. I got a question for everybody. How are people supposed to take the game seriously if a bunch of excuse makers, enraged by a system that's inaccurate to begin with, are saying the game is at fault for every instance of their misfortune? Is it possible that the message we might be sending is that our game might not be worth playing or worth anybody's time? And can we take a second to step back and realize that we actually like this game and even need it in our content creation, and that letting the ego take over can actually be harmful and lead to a community that gradually stops caring about the competitions altogether, thus leading to an eventual world where your lounge content has no value to begin with? Do you want to know what this system truly is? Well, it's fast food. It's TikTok's infinite scroll. It's quick and convenient and doesn't require much effort. It's not good for you or productive. It doesn't challenge you to do hard things or to actually work on yourself. The next step is always just to run it back, often without thought about what even went wrong in the first place. This culture very quietly holds players back in some ways. If there's always an opportunity to boost your community rank at every hour of the day, we might not take the time to actually develop as players. The average person gets one track pick a match, and if there is something on the line, there's not much of a reason to not just always pick your best track in these settings. The end result of all the runbacks is a community that has played certain tracks so much online that they are the tracks that feel most comforting to play for the chronically lounging players. Specialty tracks begin to die out for these players, even if it would probably be in their best interest to take a break and time trial for a bit to gain comfort on a track that is off meta, like I've suggested in some past videos. But perhaps what is even crazier for these players is that when they reach an MMR rating where they are in over their skis and the competition is just too tough for them, because they often don't have off-meta picks that they like, they will just resort to picking high variance tracks. Tracks with a lot of off-road, where the shock matters more, all of that stuff. This naturally slows down their fall back to reality, even if the reality is inevitable, but this variance still applies to their opponents as well who have to play these tracks, and often leads to matches with results that feel more random. I've always jokingly referred to the players who do this as gambling addicts because it really does feel like they would rather play the slots than actually play a competition, but it does truly seem as if this is unmistakably a long-term effect of the lounge. When gains are always available, players are going to chase them, even if there might be another path that's more beneficial in the long term toward getting a better rating. It all culminates in an unhealthy diet of the same few tracks and formats, and while it does help you in some ways, this diet leaves out some key nutrients toward actually becoming a better player. So yeah, if it wasn't clear, I do think lounge culture is genuinely a problem for the community. We are a bunch of players setting out to beat an elo system that is very much unbeatable, and becoming angrier people as a result of it. And while simply complaining about lounge would be a fun enough video, that's not the reason why I wanted to make this video today. Since the beginning of this channel, I've aspired to be a solutions guy, and that's no different today. Lounge does have a place in this scene in my opinion, and it wouldn't be productive to just say lounge equals bad, and as someone who is quote, self-aware of its problems, I'm not here to just act like I'm some morally superior contrarian for disliking a system that nobody else seems to have a major problem with. I just want to try to convince those of you that are still here that we should make a collective effort to want something better, especially for the next Mario Kart game. And in my opinion, this starts with revitalizing our community tournaments. What I love about tournaments is that everybody has the same opportunity in each one. When everyone gets one shot at something, that is something that cannot be taken away. There can only be one winner, the sample will be larger than 12 races for that winner, and everyone has the same opportunity to go on the win streak that results in the gold. There is no minimizing an undesirable result. There's no go next, and you don't get to erase history. You just have to work on your skills and prepare for the next one. Now, there is a lack of convenience that comes with this, but I would argue that it brings more legitimacy to our rankings. There can't be some kind of 24/7 tournament queue, and this is why I do think Lounge is valuable, so practice matches can be played whenever. But the key word here is practice. The ranking system should be derived from the tournaments, not the queue itself. Now, there was a time where community tournaments mattered a lot more, and part of it was because they were the only real opportunities to consistently play high-stake Mogi formats. The Lounge didn't really initially replace that, and it's not like it can entirely replace tournaments. We still have a lot of meaningful ones, whether that be through Summit, Momocon, or even the one-off events like Ragnarok. But when the Japanese player base did join the Lounge initially, it was a paradigm shift. The level of competition went up at the top level, as there were more players to beat out, and the tournaments that MKC organized near its own launch lost their luster as a result, because they just weren't as big as winning a tournament organized by the Japanese community. Eventually, the community would start valuing hitting specific Lounge ranks over tournament achievements altogether. This is why I think the approach has to be different in the future. At the end of the day, Lounge ranks matter because it has become the de facto player leaderboard that our community has. This was something that our prior tournaments failed to achieve, and it should be the starting point for our next great tournament series. The justification for wanting to do all of this should be clear, because we know that the Lounge leaderboard isn't really a great rating system itself. In recent years, we've had bigger cash prizes for events to try to encourage more participation in our tournaments, but for more reasons than one, this is probably not a sustainable approach long term, and this is why connecting tournaments to a ranking system would be such a valuable step in my mind. In other games, players enter tournaments to prove that they are the best. If we can infuse this mentality into a tournament series in the future, we could escape the problem of tournaments not hitting like they used to. But for it to work, players need to care about the results and outcomes not just as much as they do their Lounge rank, but even more really. What should also be noted is that in a closed system where everyone has access to the same amount of tournaments and rounds, all of that, the biggest matches can be marketed better than what we have with Lounge right now, and that would be a big plus. Someone's promotion match might be a big Lounge event for them, but a tournament finals is a big match to the entire lobby, and winning when everyone wants to win the most is great for competition in general. But what is frustrating for me is that I've already offered my solutions on this before. I've given a presentation on how to quote fix the community and bring back meaning to tournaments and competitions multiple years ago. If you are interested in this, I implore you to watch my video discussing the central rank idea. But to give a quick synopsis of it, I suggested that having a circuit with the aim of crowning a best player at the end of every year would be incredibly valuable for the community. But this circuit was not just a regular circuit idea, because I realized that our community has some special quirks about it. I mean, for starters, we have 12-player matches, and I realize that upsets happen in our events as well, and there needs to be ways for players to salvage events for their own circuit rankings, especially if there's some bad luck involved on occasion. I realize that 6v6 skill sets are valuable too and should be explored in a circuit as well. There are facets of 6v6 that are critical skills to have when it comes to being a well-rounded MK8 player, and those factors should matter. But I also realized that what is proposed in the video is hard. This is because it asks a lot out of our community. That is, let's face it, notorious for not always being as nice as it should be, with players who have been accustomed to raging or even quitting out of events entirely. Now, I do have measures included in the central rank idea to combat undesirable behavior like that, but again, these measures will only work if people actually were to care. And this is why I would never force the idea upon the community. It is why the community itself would need to show me on its own that it wants to run this and is ready for it. Now, at MomoCon last year, we did run a free 6v6 side event called the Sky League, and this idea originates from the central rank video. Now, the event didn't run perfectly, there were some fixes to make and improvements that could be added, But it was one of my favorite experiences ever playing this game, and a lot of other people gave it positive feedback as well, saying it was the most memorable experience they had playing Mario Kart 2. But the reason why I wanted to test it at MomoCon though was because lands are just awesome. Beyond just touching grass in general, lands tend to bring out the best in a community, and the required culture for an event like this to be successful is there. This is because players are very friendly in person, and because people don't tend to miss or skip events when they did pay for a venue pass. But at the end of the day, we did prove that innovative 6v6 tournaments can work, and I think we have the potential to prove a lot more too. Our tournaments could be so much more, and I know the road toward getting there won't exactly be easy, but the only way to get more out of this community is to not fall into complacency with systems like the Lounge, quite frankly. As it stands, there is a roboticness to the Lounge and the community, and it's not really ideal. It is why I'm such a big advocate of the LAN scene, because I want us to be more sociable and friendlier with each other, and I want us to be able to, hang out with new people more often. And we should want events with good vibes and positive interactions, and that should extend to Wi-Fi tournaments as well. And maybe it was just a product of a smaller community, but I used to feel that a lot more online back in the 8U days, despite the fact that we had so much less than we have now. So here we are in the present. A new game will eventually come out, and I'm sitting here waiting, desperately waiting for anyone else to really care about all of this stuff. Now, I don't expect things to change, and I'm not going to push this upon anybody else, but I would argue that fighting to protect the culture and trends we currently have going is not our best path forward. I wish we could acknowledge what is sitting right in front of us and work toward something special. But for that to happen in this way, I've got to know, man. I need to see others actually wanting to work toward something instead of remaining quiet and complacent. I need to see the desire and ambition to try something new in others. And I put a lot of effort into the Central Rank project. It was something I've thought about off and on for quite a few years even, after observing our successes and shortfalls in the past. It is something I still believe in, that I don't want to see forgotten to time. And perhaps it's not meant to be, but perhaps it is. So let me know, I suppose. And as always, thanks for watching.